Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to a brand new show on Majin Gaming called Majin Reading. This will probably be the longest show that I've ever attempted, simply because it's gonna be a while until we finish it. As you can see, this is very different from what you normally expect out of gaming channels, simply because, hey, most of gaming channels strictly strict to online gaming or to PC gaming. I'm gonna add this simply because of the one aspect that originally got me into gaming, and that is story. I have always been enthralled by great storytelling and by great ability to get characters across, to make characters loved or hated, to simply want to reach the conclusion of a story by starting at, the beginning. Some games do that, some games do not. Some games don't ignore the story altogether and devote themselves to other aspects. But to me, the story is probably the one most defining element of a game. It can only really be as big as its story. Some games have managed to break the barrier of being good without any kind of storyline, but to me, those games are shallow, superficial. Yes, I have called a lot of online competitive games shallow and superficial. They just simply do not appeal to me as a gamer. I'm the kind of guy that likes storytelling. I am an avid player of Dungeons and Dragons. I love Dragon Age. I love playing role-playing games. And let's face it, all these games need a good story. And the best stories you find in books, because books are the things that have sparked imagination across time and has helped us receive even greater mediums of storytelling. Some of the greatest movies in the world, some of the highest rated movies are based off of books or novels or short stories. The Shawshank Redemption, #1 on Internet Movie Database, is based off a short story by Stephen King. So is The Godfather. Very few exceptions. You might think that Star Wars was not based off a book. Yes, but where would Star Wars be without Asimov's stories? I kind of think nowhere. I don't think anybody would have had the imagination to really develop such an epic grand tale without books and their stories being the basis. And with that being said, I really want to get some of my favorite stories across, even though I might not be the best person to do it. I honestly realize that a Let's Read series, because that's what it is, instead of a Let's Play, should be done by somebody who has great mastery over the English language, great control over pronunciation, and doesn't exactly have an Eastern European accent to begin with. I have a small one, but still, maybe I'm not the best person to do this, but I'm gonna try nonetheless. I'm certain that the first few chapters and the first couple of weeks will be pretty hard. Sometimes I stutter, sometimes I'll get things wrong and I'll have to reread entire sentences. But I'm supposing that in time I'm gonna get better at it. You get better with practice, I suppose. With that being said, let's get right down to it. And let's start reading the first book, which is going to be from the Dark Tower series, and we're going to get through the entire Dark Tower series in the course of next year, I suppose, or maybe even more. And we're going to start off with The Gunslinger. Stephen King, The Dark Tower Gunslinger. Introduction on being 19, and a few other things. Hobbits were big when I was 19, a number of some importance in the story you are about to read. There were probably half a dozen Merrys and Pippins slogging through the mud at Max Yasgur's farm during the Great Woodstock Music Festival, twice as many Frodos, and hippie Gandalfs without number. J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings was madly popular in those days, and while I never made it to Woodstock, say sorry, I suppose I was at least I was at least a halfling hippie. Enough of one, at any rate, to have read the books and fallen in love with them. The Dark Tower books Like most long fantasy tales written by men and women of my generation, The Chronicles of Covenant by Stephen Donaldson and The Sword of Shannara by Terry Brooks are just two of them, were born of tokens. But although I had read the books in 1966 and 67, I held off writing. I responded, and with rather touching wholeheartedness, to the sweep of Tolkien's imagination, to the ambition of his story, but I wanted to write my own kind of story, and had I started then, I would have written his. That, as the late Tricky Dick Nixon would have fondly said, would have been wrong. Thanks to Mr. Tolkien, the 20th century had all the elves and wizards it needed. In 1967, I didn't have any idea what kind my story would be, but that didn't matter. I felt positive I knew it when it passed me on the street. I was 19 and arrogant. Certainly arrogant enough to feel I could wait a while longer on my muse and my masterpiece. I was sure it would be. At 19, it seemed to me, one has the right to be arrogant. Time has usually not begun its stealthy and rotten subtractions. It takes away your hair and your jump shot, according to a popular song, but in truth, it takes away a lot more than that. I didn't know it in 1966 or 67, and if I had, I wouldn't have cared. I could imagine barely being 40, but 50? No, 60? Never. 60 was out of the question. At 19, that's just the way you are. 19. 19 is the age where you say, "Look out, world, I'm smoking TNT and drinking dynamite. So if you know what's good for you, you'll get out of my way. Here comes Stevie." 19's a selfish age, and finds one carries tightly circumscribed. I had a lot of reach, and I cared about that. I had a lot of ambition, and I cared about that. I had a typewriter, and I carried from one shithole apartment to the next, always with a deck of smokes in my pocket and a smile on my face. The compromises of middle age were distant, the insult of old age barely over the horizon. Like the protagonist in the Bob Seger song that they now use to sell the trucks, I felt endlessly powerful and endlessly optimistic. My pockets were empty, my head was full of things I wanted to say, and my heart was full of stories I wanted to tell. Sounds corny, felt wonderful then. Felt very cool. More than anything, I wanted to get inside my readers' defenses, wanted to rip through them and ravage them and change them forever with nothing but a story. And I felt I could do these things. I felt I had been made to do these things. How conceited does that sound? A lot or a little? Either way, I don't apologize. I was 19. There was not so much a strand of gray hair in my beard. I had 3 pairs of jeans, 1 pair of boots, the idea that the world was at my oyster, and nothing that happened in the next 20 years proved me wrong. Then, at around the age of 29, my troubles started setting in. Drink, drugs, a road accident that changed the way I walk, among other things. I've written about them at length, and need not write about them here. Besides, it's the same for you, right? The world eventually sends out a mean-ass patrol boy to slow your progress and show you who's boss. You reading this have undoubtedly met yours, or will. I met mine, and I'm sure he'll be back. He's got my address. He's a mean guy, a bad lieutenant. He's the sworn enemy of goofery, fuckery, pride, ambition, loud music, and all things 19. But I still think that's a pretty fine age, maybe the best of age. You can rock and roll all night when the music dies and the beard wears off, you're still able to think. And dream big dreams. The mean patrol boy cuts you down to size eventually, and if you start out small, why, there's almost nothing left but the cuffs of your pants when he's done with you. Got another one, he shouts and strides off with his citation book in hand. So a little arrogance, or even a lot, isn't such a bad thing. Although your mother undoubtedly told you different. Mine did. "Pride goeth before the fall, Stephen," she said, and I found out, right around the age that is 19 times 2, that eventually you fall down anyway. Or get pushed into a ditch. At 19 they card you around in the bars and tell you you can get the fuck out or put your act and sorrier ass back in the street, but they can't card you when you sit down to paint a picture or write a poem or tell a good story. By God, and if you reading this happen to be very young, don't let the elders and supposed betters tell you any different. Sure, you've never been to Paris. No, you've never ran with the bulls at Pamplona. Yes, you're a pissant who has no hair in his had no hair in his armpits until 3 years ago. But so what? If you don't start off too big for your britches, how are you ever gonna fill them when you grow up? Let it rip regardless of what anybody tells you. That's my idea. Sit down and smoke that baby. I think novelists come in two types, and that includes the sort of fleeting novelist I was back in 1970. Those who are bound for the more literary or serious side of the job examine every possible subject in the light of this question. What would writing this story mean to me? Those whose destiny, or Ka if you'd like, is to include the writing of popular novels are apt to ask a very different one. What would writing this story mean to others? The serious novelist is looking for answers and keys to the self. The popular novelist is looking for an audience. Both kinds of writers are equally selfish. I've known a good deal of many, and will set my watch and wallet upon it. Anyway, I believe that even at the age of 19, I recognized the story of Frodo and his efforts to rid himself of the one great ring as belonging to the second group. There were adventures of an essentially British band of pilgrims set against a backdrop of vaguely Norse mythology. I liked the idea of a quest, loved it in fact, but I had no interest in either Tolkien's sturdy peasant characters, that's not to say that I didn't like them, because I did, or his bosky Scandinavian settings. If I tried going in that direction, I'd get it all wrong. So I waited. By 1970 I was 22. The first strands of gray showed up in my beard. I think smoking 2 packs of Pall Mall a day probably had something to do with that. But even at 22, one can afford to wait. At 22, time is still on one side, although even then, that bad old patrol boy is in the neighborhood and asking questions. Then, in an almost completely empty movie theater, the Bijou in Bangor, Maine if it matters, I saw a film directed by Sergio Leone. It was called The Good, the Bad and the Ugly. And before the film was even over, I realized what I wanted to write was a novel that contained Tolkien's sense of quest and magic, but set up against Leone's almost absurdly majestic Western backdrop. If you've only seen this gonzo Western on your television screen, you don't understand what I'm talking about. Cry your pardon, but it's true. On a movie screen projected through the correct Panavision lens, TG, TB, and TU, is an epic rival Ben-Hur. Clint Eastwood appears roughly 18 feet tall, with each weary jet of stubble on his cheeks looking roughly the size of a young redwood tree. The grooves bracketing Lee Van Cleef's mouth are as deep as canyons, and there would be a thinny, see Wizard and Glass, at the bottom of each one. The desert setting appeared to stretch at least for as far as the orbit of the planet Neptune, and the barrel of each gun looks to be roughly as large as the Holland Tunnel. What I wanted even more than the setting was the feeling of epic, apocalyptic size. The fact that Leone knew jack shit about American geography, according to one of the characters, Chicago is somewhere in the vicinity of Phoenix, Arizona, added to the film's sense of magnificent dislocation. And in my enthusiasm, the sort of only a young person can muster, I think, I wanted to write not just a long book, but the longest popular novel in history. I did not succeed doing that, but I felt I had a decent rip. The Dark Tower volumes 1 through 7 really comprise a single tale, and the first 4 volumes run just over 2,000 pages in paperback. The final 3 volumes run another 2,500 in manuscript. I'm not trying to imply here the length has anything to do whatsoever with quality. I'm just saying that I wanted to write an epic, and in some ways I succeeded. If you were to ask me why I wanted to do that, I couldn't tell you. Maybe it's part of growing up an American, build the tallest, dig the deepest, write the longest. And that head-scratching puzzlement and the question of motivation comes up. Seems to me that it's also part of being American. In the end, we are reduced to saying one thing. It seemed to be a good idea at the time. Another thing about being 19, do it please ya, is the age. I think where a lot of us somehow get stuck, mentally and emotionally, if not physically. The years slide by, and one day you find yourself looking in the mirror with real puzzlement. Why are those lines on my face? You wonder. Where did that stupid potbelly come from? Hell, I'm only 19. This is hardly an original concept, but that in no way subtracts from one's amazement. Time puts gray in your beard, takes away your jump shot, and all the while you're thinking, silly you, that it's still on your side. The logical side of you knows better, but your heart refuses to believe it. If you're lucky, the patrol boy who cited you for going too fast and having too much fun also gives you a dose of smelling salts. That was more or less what happened to me near the end of the 20th century. It came in the form of a Plymouth van that knocked me into a ditch beside the road in my hometown. About 3 years after the accident, I did a book signing from a Buick 8 at Border Store in Dearborn, Michigan. Where one guy when one guy got to the head of the line, he said he was really glad that I was still alive. I get this a lot, and it still beats the shit out of. Well, at least the hell you didn't die. I suppose this good friend of mine. I was with this good friend of mine when we heard you got popped, he said. Man, we just started shaking our heads and saying, there goes the tower. It's tilting, it's falling. Ah, shit, he'll never finish it now. A version of the same idea had occurred to me. The troubling idea that having built the Dark Tower in the collective imagination of millions of readers, I might have a responsibility to make it safe for as long as people wanted to read about it. That might be for only 5 years, for all I knew. It might be 500. Fantasy stories, the bad as well as the good, even now someone's out there probably reading Varney the Vampire or The Monk, seem to have a long shelf life. Roland's way of protecting the tower is to try and remove the threat of the beams that hold the tower up. I would have to do with it, I realized after my accident, but finishing the Gunslinger story. During the long pauses between the writing and publication of the first 4 Dark Tower tales, I received hundreds of "pack your bags, we're going on a guild trip" letters. In 1998, when I was laboring under the mistaken impression that I was still basically 19, in other words, I got one from an 82-year-old grandma. Don't mean to bother you with my troubles, but very sick these days. The grandma told me she's probably had only a year to live, 14 more at the side, cancer all through me. And while she didn't expect me to finish Roland's tale in time just for her, she wanted to know if I couldn't please, just tell her how it came out. The line that retched at my heart, although not quite enough to start writing again, was her promise not to tell a single soul. A year later, probably after the accident had landed me in the hospital, one of my assistants, Marcia DeFilippo, got a letter from a fellow on death row either in Texas or Florida, wanting to know essentially the same thing. How does it come out? He promised to take the secret to the grave with him, which gave me the creeps. I would have given both these folks what they wanted, a summary of Roland's further adventures, if I could have done, but alas, I couldn't. I had no idea how things were going to turn out with the gunslinger and his friends. To know, I have to write. I once had an outline, but I lost it along the way. It probably wasn't worth a tin of shit anyway. All I had was a few notes. Chusset, chisset, chasset, something basket, reads one lying on the desk as I write this. Eventually, starting in July 2001, I began to write again. I knew by then I was no longer 19, nor exempt from any of the ills which the flesh is their heir. I knew I was going to be 60, maybe even 70, and I wanted to finish my story before the bad patrol boy came for me the last time. I had no urge to be filed with the Canterbury Tales or the mystery of Edwin Drood. The result, for better or for worse, lies before you, constant reader, whether you're reading this starting with Volume 1 or are preparing for Volume 5. Like it or hate it, the story of Roland is now done. I hope you enjoy it. As for me, I had the time of my life. Stephen King, January 25th, 2003. Foreword. Most of what the writers write about in their work is ill-informed bullshit. That is why you have never seen a book entitled 100 Great Instructions of Western Civilization or Best Loved Forewords of American People. This is a judgment call on my part, of course, but after writing at least 50 introductions and forewords, not to mention an entire book about the craft of fiction, I think it's one I have a right to make. And I think you can take me seriously when I tell you this might be one of the rare occasions upon which I actually have something worth saying. A few years ago, I created some furor among my readers by offering a revised and expanded version of my novel The Stand. I was justifiably nervous about that book because The Stand had always been the novel my readers had loved the best. As far as the most passionate of The Stand fans are concerned, I could have died in 1980 without making the world a noticeably poorer place. If there is a story that rivals The Stand in the imagination of King's readers, it's probably the tale of Roland Deschain and his search for the Dark Tower. And now, goddamn, I've gone and done the same thing again. Except I haven't, not really. And I want you to know it. I also want you to know that I have done, and why. What I have done and why. It may not be important to you, but it's very important to me, and thus this foreword is exempt, I hope, from King's bullshit rule. First, please be reminded that The Stand sustained deep cuts in the manuscript, not for editorial reasons, but for financial ones. There were binding limitations, too, but I don't even want to go there. What I reinstated in the late 80s were revised sections of pre-existing manuscript. I also revised the work as a whole, mostly acknowledging the AIDS epidemic which blossomed, if that is the word, between the first issue of The Stand and the publication of the revised version 8 or 9 years later. The result was a volume of about 100,000 words, longer than the original. In the case of the Gunslinger, the original volume was slim, and the added material in this version amounts to a mere 35 pages, or about 9,000 words. If you have read the Gunslinger before, you'll only find 2 or 3 totally new scenes. The Dark Tower purists, of which there are a surprising number, just check the web, will want to read the book again, of course, and most of them are apt to do with a mixture of curiosity and irritation. I sympathize, but I must say I'm less concerned with them than with the readers who have never encountered Roland and his quartet. In spite of his fervent followers, the tale of the tower is far less known by my readers than The Stand is. Sometimes, when I do readings, I'll ask those present to raise their hands if they've read one or more of my novels. Since they've bothered to come at all, sometimes going to the added inconvenience of hiring a babysitter and incurring the added expense of gassing up the old sedan, it comes to no surprise that most of them will raise their hands. Then I ask them to keep their hands up if they read one or more of the Dark Tower stories. When I do that, at least half the hands in the hall invariably go down. The conclusion is clear enough. Although I've spent an inordinate amount of time writing these books in the 33 years between 1970 and 2003, comparatively few people have read them. Yet those who have are passionate about them, and I'm fairly passionate about myself. Enough so, in any case, that I was never able to let Roland creep away into exile, which is unhappy home of unfulfilled characters. Think of Chaucer's Pilgrim on the way to Canterbury, or the people who populate Charles Dickens' unfinished final novel, The Mystery of Edwin Drood. I think that I'd always assumed, somewhere in the back of my mind, for I cannot even remember thinking about the conclusion, about this consciously, not the conclusion, that there would be times to finish, and perhaps God would even send me a singing telegram at the appointed hour. Diddly-dum, diddly-dower, get back to work, Stephen, finish the tower. And in a way something like that did happen, although it wasn't singing telegram but a close encounter with a Plymouth minivan that got me going again. If the vehicle that struck me that day had been a little bigger, or if it had hit me just a little square on, it would have been a case of mourners please omit the followers, the King family thanks you for your sympathy, and Roland's quest would have remained forever unfinished, and at least by me. In any case, in 2001, by which time I'd begun to feel more myself again, I decided the time had come to finish Roland's story. I pushed everything else aside and set work to the final 3 books. As always, I did this not so much for the readers who demanded it, as it for myself. Although this revision of the last 2 volumes still remain to be done as I write this in the winter of 2003, the books themselves were finished last summer, and in the hiatus between the editorial work on Volume 5, Wolves of the Kala, and Volume 6, Song of Susanna, I decided the time had come to go back to the beginning at the start and the final overall revisions. Why? Because these 7 volumes were never really separate stories at all, but sections of a single long novel called The Dark Tower. At the beginning was out of sync with the ending. My approach to revision hasn't changed much over the years. I know there are writers who do it as they go along, but my method of attack has always been to plunge in and go as fast as I can, keeping the edge of my narrative blade as sharp as possible by constant use and trying to outrun the novelist's most insidious enemy, which is doubt. Looking back prompts too many questions. How believable are my characters? How interesting is my story? How good is this really? Will anyone care? Do I care myself? When my first draft of the novel is done, I put it away, warts and all, to mellow. Some period of time later, 6 months, a year, 2 years, it doesn't really matter, I can come back to it with a cooler but still loving eye, and begin the task of revising. And although each book of the Tower series has been revised as a separate entity, I never really looked at the work as a whole until I finished Volume 7, The Dark Tower. When I looked back at the first volume, which you now hold in your hands, 3 obvious truths present themselves. The first was that the Gunslinger had been written by a very young man, and had all the problems of a very young man's book. The second was that it contained a great many number of errors and false starts, particularly in the light of the volumes that followed. The third was that the Gunslinger did not even sound like the later books. It was, frankly, rather difficult to read. All too often I heard myself apologizing for it and telling people that if they persevered, they would find the story. Really found its voice in the drawing of the 3. At one point, the gunslinger, Roland, is described as the sort of man who would straighten pictures in strange hotel rooms. I'm that sort of guy myself, and to some extent that is all that rewriting amounts to: straightening the pictures, vacuuming the floors, scrubbing the toilets. I did a great deal of housework in the corners of this revision, and I had a chance to do what any writer wants to do with a work that is finished but still needs a final polish and tune it up. Just make it right. Once you know how things come out, you owe it to the potential reader and to yourself to go back and put things in order. That is what I have tried to do here, always being careful that no addition or change should give away the secrets hidden in the last 3 books of the cycle. Secrets I have been patiently keeping for as long as 30 years in some cases. Before I close, I should say a word about the younger man who dared to write this book. The young man had been exposed to far too many writing seminars and had grown far used to the ideas those seminars promulgated. That one is writing for other people rather than oneself, that language is more important than story, that ambiguity is to be preferred over clarity and simplicity, which are usually the signs of a thick and literal-minded. As a result, I was not surprised to find a high degree of pretension in Roland's debut appearance, not to mention what seemed like 1,000 unnecessary adverbs. I removed as much of this hollow blather as I could, and I do not regret any single cut made in this regard. In other places, invariably those where I'd been seduced into forgetting the writer's seminar ideas by some particularly entrancing piece of story, I was able to let the writing almost entirely alone, save for the unusual bits of revision any writer needs to do. As I have pointed out in another context, only God gets it right the first time. In any case, I didn't want to muzzle or even rely change in the way the story is told. For all its faults, it has its own special charm. it seems to me. To change it too completely would have been to repudiate the person who first wrote the Gunslinger in the late spring and early summer of 1970, and that I did not want to do. What I did want to do, and before the final volumes of the series came out if possible, was to give newcomers to the Tale of the Tower, and the old readers who wanted to refresh their memories, a clearer start and a slightly easier entry into Roland's world. I also wanted to have them a volume that more efficiently foreshadowed coming events. I hope that I have done that. And if you are one of those who have never visited the strange world through which Roland and his friends move, I hope you will enjoy the marvels you find there. More than anything, I wanted to tell you a tale of wonder. If you find yourself falling under the spell of the Dark Tower even a bit, I reckon I will have done my job, which has begun in 1970 and largely finished in 2003. Yet Roland would be the first to point out that such a span of time means very little. In fact, when one quests for the Dark Tower, time is a matter of no concern at all. February 6, 2003. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for being here with the first part and the first few pages of the first volume in the Dark Tower series, The Gunslinger. Next time, that is tomorrow, we will actually get inside the book and start reading the actual story, and hopefully you guys will get as much fun out of it as I do. I'll promise I'll get better at reading this in time, and hopefully less and less stuttering will occur and less and less bad reading words. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time.